Welcome back. The Russia investigation's focus on a few individuals seems to be ramping up, in particular, former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort. New reporting this week from the New York Times and CNN, some of which we've confirmed at NBC News, some of which hasn't been confirmable, has showed increasing scrutiny on Manafort. CNN is reporting, in fact, that a FISA court granted a wiretap of Manafort both before and after the election, including into the early part of this year, when he was known to talk to President Trump. We also learned this week, first reported by the New York Times and confirmed by NBC News, that Manafort's home was raided over the summer using a no-knock warrant. The Times also reported prosecutors told Manafort they do plan to indict him. Manafort has been a fixture in Republican politics for a long time, going back to Gerald Ford in 1976. But in more recent years, his work has expanded to include lobbying and political consulting on behalf of foreign governments and foreign candidates, including those linked to Russian-backed forces in Ukraine. And this week, we learned of another connection, Manafort and this man, Oleg Deripaska. He's a Russian billionaire who is known to be among 2 or 3 oligarchs that Putin turns to on a regular basis. This was first reported by the Washington Post. He's also been repeatedly denied entry into the United States over alleged ties to organized crime. And despite all of that, it came to light this week that emails show Manafort offered Deripaska a private briefing on the campaign just 2 weeks before the Republican National Convention. Joining me now is my colleague Ken Delaney, and he, of course, covers intelligence and national security issues for NBC News, and his beat is basically this investigation. That's probably the best way to describe this at this point. Your beat is this investigation. Yeah. So, Paul Manafort. The focus is intensifying, but is he a central figure, or is he a side figure that Mueller plans to use to help him with the central part of this case?
Well, I think both. Right now, he's a central figure because that's where the evidence is leading Mueller. And you're starting to see people close to the president disavow Manafort, which I find fascinating.
Corey Lewandowski.
Absolutely.
Now, he did it on this show much earlier, and he basically said if any of this is true, he should go to jail. And now he personalized it even more.
That's right. And the president's lawyer, Todd Cobb, said, we never thought Paul Manafort would monetize his role as campaign chairman, and that refers to these emails where he's offering this billionaire that you just showed, Oleg Deripaska, a private briefing 2 weeks before Donald Trump was nominated as the Republican nominee for president. Now, that's significant because this is a man very close to the Kremlin. This Trump Tower meeting, which I think is significant, involved Russians who are kind of nobodies. Oleg Deripaska is not a nobody. He's a very significant figure, one of 2 or 3 people, according to a State Department cable, that Vladimir Putin relies on in the oligarch circle and talks to a lot. And he had this relationship with Manafort going back to 2007, a financial relationship, and it continued on during the campaign when Paul Manafort was running Donald Trump's campaign.
You just said, you quoted Ty Cobb now as sort of essentially throwing Manafort under the bus. That seems to be that's a tricky decision to make if you're on the president's legal team and you do that, because there has been an assumption, and I want to be careful here on the assuming, but there's been an assumption that part of the play here by Mueller is to squeeze Manafort, that they have found a lot of irregularities involving where he reported money, maybe simply tax evasion, all sorts of issues of how he handled his operations when it came to Ukraine. That may have anything to do with the central collusion question, but he committed crimes. And they squeeze him. You would think that the president's legal team wouldn't be throwing him under the bus unless they're really worried about him.
Unless and we should say, obviously, he denies committing crimes, but unless they've already concluded that Mueller has so much leverage against Manafort. Manafort is on the road to indictment.
Inevitable.
The ship has sailed. I mean, he's going to cooperate and say what he knows. And the question is, what does he know? Was this just Paul Manafort running his own show inside the campaign with these ties to senior Russians, or was he coordinating it with Donald Trump and others? And what was Mike Flynn doing?
I want to ask you this on the Mueller investigation. There seems to be a lot of, we know a lot about what's happening with Manafort. Not quite sure if it's central or not central. We know a lot about apparently what Mueller's efforts to investigate whether the president was obstructing justice and how he handled Comey and Flynn. But neither one are about the central issue, which is the Russian interference. Did Americans help? Where are we on that aspect of it?
Well, it's interesting. Today, Facebook disclosed that they are turning over to Congress these 1,000 Russian ads that they disclosed a few weeks ago were place during the campaign. That is an unexplored area of this whole Russian interference campaign. The fake news, the use of social media. We haven't heard much from Twitter. Adam Schiff, the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, said today, look, we want to hear from these social media companies. We want them to come to the Hill and testify about what happened here, because the Russians clearly use social media to influence the American voter, but we don't know to what extent, how much was spent, and we don't know whether any Americans cooperated with that effort.
Do we have a sense of what legally Twitter and Facebook are required to turn over and what legally they aren't?
That's a hazy area. You know, Facebook said today they did this very reluctantly. They don't like to turn over content, but of course they are like anyone else. They have to respond to a Mueller
Are they responding to a subpoena?
That's not clear.
Okay.
So I think there's a threat.
So this is a case of don't make us subpoena you? Here's what we want. Don't make us subpoena you?
It may well be.
And has Twitter turned stuff over yet? Or?
You know, we haven't heard much about Twitter. And Twitter, of all the companies, has been the most reluctant to cooperate with this stuff and to talk about any of it. Now, in fairness, there isn't the kind of ad buying with Twitter that you would see on Facebook.
No, but it's the accounts and being able to study the bots and the patterns of that, right? And tracing back where these folks exist.
But our own Clint Watts, who's an expert on this, the former FBI agent, will tell you that it's really hard to get behind that on Twitter, because you can come and go with an account with total anonymity. And it's going to be really difficult to trace that stuff.
All right. The fog is still there anyway. Ken Delanian, thank you very much. After the break, California, they're trying to challenge